In February 20th, 24, Buckingham Palace issued a statement that brought the nation to a standstill. King Charles III, who had waited decades for the crown, was diagnosed with cancer. The news didn't arrive through a grand speech, but rather through a carefully phrased update following what was initially described as a routine procedure for an enlarged prostate. 4 years, Charles had maintained an image of strength, calm, resolute, and unwavering. But now, reality began to seep through the palace's gilded facade. The monarchy's foundation started to shift, and with it came an unspoken wave of anxiety. The diagnosis sent tremors across the United Kingdom. It wasn't just the king's health that caused concern. It was what the illness represented. Fragility at the very summit of national life. The palace offered no specific details about the type of cancer, only assuring the public that it was detected early. That lack of clarity was intentional. In a world governed by appearances, uncertainty sparked speculation. Was the illness severe? Would Charles be able to continue his reign? Were succession plans already in motion behind closed doors? These were not just tabloid rumors. Such questions echoed through the corridors of Parliament, dominated headlines, and stirred unease in households throughout Britain. A country already shaken by years of royal drama now faced yet another looming disruption. Despite the doubt surrounding his health, King Charles chose not to retreat. Just weeks after the public announcement, he resumed his royal duties, his appearances brief but deliberate, his smiles measured, his reassurances softly spoken. This wasn't merely an act of obligation. It was a demonstration of resolve. He understood that stepping aside prematurely could plunge the monarchy into instability, even as he faced the reality that time might no longer be on his side. Behind the palace walls, contingency plans quietly resurfaced, strategies no sovereign ever wishes to enact. Advisors and staff worked relentlessly in the background, preparing for the possibility that the crown might pass on sooner than anticipated, not due to personal choice, but because of circumstance. The notion that Charles, after waiting most of his life to ascend the throne, might have only a short reign felt both tragic and inevitable. Amid this uncertainty, the royal family maintained a composed front. Queen Camilla remained a steadfast partner, offering visible support by the king's side. Prince William, the ever-reliable heir, began to take on a more prominent public role. Yet behind each practiced smile and official appearance, a sense of urgency lingered. The monarchy could not afford to appear vulnerable, not now, and certainly not again. As the nation came to grips with the deeper implications of the king's illness, someone else within the royal circle was facing a deeply personal struggle, quietly enduring it behind palace walls. She had stood loyally beside Prince William through moments of happiness and sorrow alike. Over the years, she had weathered relentless media scrutiny, invasive rumors, and constant comparisons to a mother-in-law she never had the chance to know. And now she was preparing to share a revelation that would once again change everything. In March 20th, 24, a palace statement was released, one that left the entire nation in stunned silence. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been diagnosed with cancer. The news sent shockwaves across the globe. For so long, she had embodied elegance, composure, and quiet strength. Yet beneath a serene exterior, she was now facing the most personal and daunting challenge of her life. In a royal institution built on tradition and controlled appearances, Catherine made a bold and unexpected choice. She spoke candidly. Her announcement didn't come via a typical press bulletin, but through a thoughtfully produced video that defied convention. Her tone was steady, but the emotion in her words was unmistakable. She spoke openly about her diagnosis, her journey into preventative chemotherapy, and the heavy emotional toll of revealing something so intimate to the world. There was no attempt to soften the truth, no cryptic messaging, only honesty. It was rare, almost unheard of, for a royal to acknowledge vulnerability so publicly. But Catherine wasn't seeking pity. She was offering strength. In doing so, she broke the long-standing silence around illness within the royal household. The public's response was swift and heartfelt. People across Britain and far beyond united in support. Cancer patients, survivors, and families poured out messages of solidarity on social media. News anchors fought back tears on live television. Even the tabloids, typically relentless in their treatment of the royals, paused to show respect. Catherine had achieved what few could. She made royalty relatable. She reminded the world that beneath the titles and traditions, she was human. and in doing so, she inspired countless others. In the following months, she continued her treatment quietly, away from public view. Her absence from royal engagement sparked widespread speculation, but her silence spoke volumes. It wasn't a withdrawal. It was a period of transformation. No longer defined solely as a supportive spouse or the polished mother of a future monarch, she emerged as something much stronger, a survivor. By September 20th, 24, she announced she had completed chemotherapy, and a wave of relief swept the nation. From Kensington Palace to hospital ward across the country, people exhaled. By January 20th, 25, Catherine had entered remission, but her return to royal duties marked a new chapter. She came back changed, more resilient, more focused, more driven, and she immediately got to work. Her public appearances now carried deeper meaning, not just due to her status, but because of the journey she had endured. She stepped forward as a vocal advocate for early cancer detection, equitable treatment access, and emotional resilience amid illness. Her speeches, once carefully measured and restrained, now carried a quiet intensity. She had found her voice, and people listened. As her health improved and her influence expanded, another transformation was quietly taking place. Her position within the royal family was beginning to evolve. Once bound by tradition and quiet support, she began to evolve. Behind palace doors, hushed conversations unfolded. Discussions never meant for public ears. While Catherine had battled her illness in silence, what followed would place her in a role no one had entirely foreseen. Emerging from the shadows of her illness, Princess Catherine didn't merely reappear. She transformed the very idea of public presence. The woman who had endured one of life's harshest trials now stood at the heart of national admiration, stronger, wiser, and more empowered than ever. Yet her transformation wasn't defined by a crown or a title. It was something gentler, more intentional, something that would take root and bloom. The Royal Horticultural Society, known for its deep-rooted traditions and historic prestige, introduced a new rose, a coral pink floribunda. Soft yet striking, delicate yet resilient, it bore a simple but powerful name, Catherine's Rose. This was more than a symbolic gesture. Carefully cultivated by Harkis roses, the flower was chosen not only for its beauty but for what it stood for. Its scent, laced with whispers of Turkish delight, evoked grace and refinement, but its significance ran deeper. Each sale of Catherine's Rose would support the Royal Marston Cancer Charity, the very institution that had once walked beside her through her darkest hours. It was a poignant, full-circle moment, a living symbol of her path, a quiet tribute to her pain, her strength, and a journey of healing now offered to others. When the rose was unveiled at the prestigious RHS Chelsea Flower Show in May 20th, 25, it was more than an exhibition of horticulture. It marked a shift in cultural perception. The Princess of Wales had become more than an icon of elegance. She had become a beacon of resilience. Among the polished displays and royal pageantry, her rose stood not just as a floral ornament but as a statement. Nature, once her sanctuary, now carried her message to the world. And that message was unmistakable. There is power in vulnerability, strength in survival, and meaning in using that strength to uplift others. Yet it wasn't only the rose that moved hearts. It was the story behind it. The purpose, the timing, the symbolism. Catherine had stepped beyond the confines of royal expectation and created something deeply human, deeply impactful. In doing so, she reshaped how people saw her, not just as a future queen, but as a true leader, one who had endured suffering and made the conscious choice to rise. Not just someone waving from a balcony, but someone who met people in their pain, their hopes, their healing. As Catherine's Rose began to bloom in gardens and homes across the UK, so too did her influence. She was no longer merely admired, she was deeply respected. The world had witnessed her fall, and then her quiet, purposeful rise. With each petal of her namesake flower, the monarchy inched closer to something renewed. Not just tradition, but transformation. What many overlooked, however, was that Catherine's tribute wasn't the first of its kind. It was part of a growing legacy, one already reflected in the lives of her children, whose own symbolic meanings had begun to blossom. Even before Catherine's Rose took the spotlight, the tradition of naming flowers after members of the royal family had flourished into a quiet, powerful language of legacy, a garden that continues to grow with each generation. These weren't just random acts. They were symbolic gestures, public tributes that rooted each royal family member into the cultural fabric of Britain. Much like the monarchy itself, every flower planted told a layered, meaningful, and deeply personal story. And it all began with a name, George, a name carrying the weight of legacy and expectation. When Prince George was born in 2013, celebrations echoed across the Commonwealth. But beyond the fanfare, it was the introduction of the Georgie boy daffodil that quietly marked his place in a more symbolic history. Bold, upright, and resilient, the daffodil wasn't selected merely for its springtime appeal. It stood for endurance, strength. In April 20th, 25, a spring awakened the Scottish Highlands. Prince William and Princess Catherine celebrated 14 years of marriage. There was no grand palace celebration, no media spectacle, just a return to the place where it all began. A private, heartfelt visit, not for the cameras, but for themselves, a quiet homage to the roots of their enduring story. What the public saw as a formal appearance was, in truth, something deeply personal, an intimate acknowledgement of how far they had come, not just as members of the royal family, but as partners. Their journey, which began with youthful curiosity at St. Andrews, had evolved into a powerful testament to endurance, one tested by public scrutiny, time apart, and, most recently, a life-threatening illness. An ordeal that could have shattered even the strongest relationships instead solidified theirs. Their anniversary wasn't just a milestone. It was a quiet declaration of unity. While in Scotland, the couple allowed brief glimpses into their private bond, subtle gestures, a hand resting gently on an arm, a prolonged glance, spoke volumes. In a family where emotions are often hidden behind duty, their visible tenderness stood out. Catherine, having emerged from a grueling fight with cancer, didn't look to William as a prince, but as a steady presence. And he, in turn, embodied a calm, protective strength that didn't require words. This wasn't the cold, formal couple the tabloids once painted. They were something more genuine, more resilient. Throughout Catherine's treatment, William never wavered. While the palace remained silent to the public, behind closed doors he balanced royal obligations with being a devoted father and unwavering supporter. He was there through every corridor, every quiet moment in sterile hospital rooms. Away from the spotlight, the roots of their marriage grew deeper. And when Catherine reappeared before the public, it was with William by her side, a steady symbol of a love that doesn't seek attention but shows up unwavering and present. People watched with respect and admiration. What began as a fairy tale romance between a university girl and a future king had grown into something far more powerful. A partnership built on mutual sacrifice, trust, and enduring strength. In facing hardship together, they didn't just capture the hearts of the British public. They moved people around the world. They were no longer just future monarchs. They had become figures of steadiness in an unpredictable era. Not flawless, but enduring. Not idealized, but deeply real. Yet, alongside the admiration, a quieter transformation was unfolding. With every appearance and every shared duty, Catherine was stepping into her own. No longer defined only by her role beside William, she began to emerge as a royal figure in her own right. Her bond with him remained central, but her presence was becoming equally significant. It was clear that her path, once running parallel to William's, was now carving its own distinct course, one the monarchy could no longer overlook. There was a time when the phrase "a people's princess" evoked only one image, Diana. Her empathy, her defiance of tradition, her tragic end, all etched into public memory. But over time, as grief softened and history continued, a new name began to gently echo alongside hers. Not to replace Diana, but to carry her spirit forward, Catherine. The similarity wasn't just in grace or elegance. It was in intention, in authenticity, in the way she walked not above the people but among them. Catherine's rise didn't happen in a single moment. It wasn't defined by any grand gesture, but by a steady accumulation of choices grounded in compassion, purpose, and quiet strength. Her schedule became increasingly packed with appearances and commitments, surpassing what had ever been expected of her. Each visit, each conversation, and each initiative seemed to hold more significance than the last. From advocating for mental health to supporting early childhood development, she did more than just lend her name. She poured her heart into these causes. Her speeches, once careful and rehearsed, grew more confident and genuine. She no longer spoke as a figurehead, but as someone who had lived through challenges, learned from them, and now sought to change the narrative for others. The media, always eager for comparisons, began to highlight not scandals but sincerity. Much like Diana, Catherine wasn't afraid to kneel beside a child in pain or meet the gaze of a grieving mother. She didn't need to shout to be heard, nor did she have to break conventions to shift perceptions. Instead, she crafted a new path, one that balanced royal tradition with modern expectations with nearly flawless precision. Her wardrobe spoke of legacy. Her causes demanded attention. And sometimes her silence spoke volumes that words could not. What grew wasn't just admiration but expectation. People didn't just like Catherine. They began to look up to her, to emulate her, and to wonder what kind of queen she might one day become. Behind the palace walls, this shifting perception didn't go unnoticed. In a monarchy obsessed with its image, Catherine had become its most powerful symbol. She was a monarchy's response to a world that was changing, respectful of the crown's tradition, yet forward-thinking enough to redefine it. The more she appeared, the more the public leaned in. The more she endured, the deeper their investment in her story. With every step, Diana's shadow no longer hung over her. It illuminated her path. But with that growing light came a growing sense of responsibility. Catherine's influence was no longer just a personal achievement. It was reshaping the monarchy itself. The older generation within the institution could sense it, and the public's demands for more from her only pushed the monarchy to adapt more quickly than it was accustomed to. As talks of succession grew louder and King Charles III held raised concerns behind closed doors, an unspoken question began to take shape. Was this more than just admiration? Was it a sign of preparation? Because as Catherine rose to meet the public's gaze, the throne itself started to seem within reach. By 2025, an uncomfortable reality settled over Buckingham Palace like an undeniable fog. King Charles III, though steadfast and outwardly calm, was no longer the untouchable symbol of royal resilience. Insider whispers painted a picture more urgent than the public eyes, polished appearances suggested. His remission was real, but it remained fragile. Behind the gilded palace doors, contingency plans were no longer hypothetical. They were becoming active. Senior courtiers, long trained to anticipate the inevitable, had accelerated the machinery of succession. Documents that were once kept sealed were now being reviewed, and protocols that had gathered dust were being revived, not for a state funeral, but for something just as monumental, a premature transfer of power. The king hadn't abdicated, but the real question was no longer if, but when. That question now carried a weight that even his most trusted advisors could feel in every tense conversation and unspoken pause. At the center of this growing uncertainty was a couple the world had begun to view through a new lens. Prince William and Princess Catherine, once regarded as distant heirs, were gradually being positioned not next to the throne, but in front of it. Their public engagements increased, and their presence at significant events became more frequent. Without announcing it, the palace communications team suddenly redirected the spotlight, and the world took notice. Headlines across Europe and America no longer questioned whether William would become king, but focused on how soon it might happen. However, the media wasn't the only force driving this narrative. Sources close to the royal family confirmed that private meetings were taking on a more strategic nature. Legal teams were reassessing estates, and military briefings once reserved for the reigning monarch were reportedly being shared with William. As these actions became more difficult to hide, public curiosity shifted into expectation. Polls indicated that an increasing number of citizens supported a smooth early transition. They believed the monarchy needed youth, stability, and vision, all qualities that William and Catherine seemed to represent. For the royal family, it was a delicate balance, on one hand honoring the king's legacy and his struggle with illness, and on the other recognizing that the monarchy's survival depended on progress, not nostalgia. Every move William and Catherine made in public seemed calculated but essential. A handshake was no longer just a gesture. It became a glimpse into future leadership. A speech was more than a statement. It was a practice run for governance. Behind these seemingly small moments, the palace moved with careful consideration toward a potential historic shift in the monarchy. Yet, it wasn't just the logistics and public perception that were undergoing change. Beneath the surface, something more personal was unfolding, something the media had yet to fully capture. Amid the growing political speculation and strategic maneuvers, a single private moment would reshape the entire narrative of this transition. This moment didn't revolve around William, but Catherine. The meeting she was about to have with the king would reveal more about the future of the monarchy than any official announcement ever could. It took place quietly, away from the press, the cameras, and the endless chatter of palace aides, a simple, private lunch with only two people. One was a monarch whose reign was now overshadowed by uncertainty, and the other was a woman once dismissed by the royal press as common, now standing on the brink of something much more significant. When King Charles invited Princess Catherine to dine with him that day, it was more than just a polite gesture. It was a moment of immense consequence. Behind the closed door, something fundamental shifted, not just in tone but in power. And though the palace issued no statement, the weight of that conversation would resonate far beyond Buckingham Palace. The impact of that meeting was undeniable, sparking immediate speculation. What could they have discussed? Was it simply a reflection on her recent recovery and return to public life? Or was there something more significant at play? Perhaps it was an acknowledgement of the role Catherine was now being prepared to take on. For years, she had been regarded as a graceful consort, supportive but secondary. Yet in the wake of King Charles's health struggles and William's quiet preparation for the throne, Catherine had grown into more than just a symbolic royal figure. She was evolving into a powerful presence, and it appeared the king was ready to recognize it, if only to her. Royal observers began to dissect every detail, the timing, the ruling, and even the lunch menu, which was leaked by insiders. However, the true significance wasn't in those details. It lay in the symbolism. A king unsure of how much longer he could bear the weight of the crown, meeting with a woman who, in the eyes of the public, had already begun to carry it in spirit. This wasn't a formal meeting about succession planning. It was something much more personal, more potent. It was a reckoning, a moment of acknowledgement, and perhaps a quiet transfer of trust. In the following days, subtle signs began to emerge. Catherine was given more solo engagements. Her role alongside the Queen Consort grew, and her presence next to William took on a new gravity, no longer just complimentary, but commanding. Commentators began to describe Catherine not merely as a future queen, but as a current architect of the royal image. The public responded in kind. Approval ratings surged, with polls showing strong support not only for William's eventual reign, but for Catherine's leadership beside him. People weren't just watching her rise. They were actively supporting it. If that lunch indeed marked the passing of a torch, it wasn't simply from a king to a princess. It symbolized a shift from an era of tradition-bound monarchy to a new vision of leadership, one defined by empathy, resilience, and grace forged through hardship. Catherine hadn't sought power. She had earned it, quietly, through pain, brilliance, and determination. Now, while the crown may not yet rest upon her head, the weight of it has already settled on her shoulders. From a university student thrust into global attention, to a duchess molded by duty, a mother tested by crisis, and survivor who now commands the admiration of a nation, Catherine's journey is no longer solely about royalty. It's a story of resilience, transformation, and, above all, the quiet, unstoppable force of a woman who rose not because she pursued power, but because she became impossible to overlook.